So the China Syndrome was in movie theaters while the 3 Mile Island happened.
That was Kirk Douglas too, wasn't it?
Kirk Douglas, yeah.
And Jane Fonda in the China Syndrome, right.
Yeah, so the nuclear industry sees the China Syndrome and then issues a statement about how the nuclear industry is not like that. And that would never happen in the nuclear industry. And then 3 Mile Island happened.
And then a few decades later, we have The Simpsons.
We have The Simpsons and Matt Groening. Yeah, man, I have made my career off of Matt Groening's Simpsons. I have entire talks on how The Simpsons has influenced our views of nuclear technology.
Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. My guest today on Podcast for Inquiry is Professor Jason Donev. Jason leads the world's largest and most used energy resource for adults, energyeducation.ca. As a reviewer for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Jason works to help people understand nuclear power's role in providing reliable energy without emitting greenhouse gases. In today's episode, Jason talks about how much energy people around the world use, with a reminder that electricity is only a fraction of our overall energy budget. Jason describes nuclear energy's advantages and disadvantages compared with other major sources of electricity, and we also discuss some of the concerns people have about nuclear energy, including its overall safety and storing its waste products. It's with great pleasure that I bring you my conversation with Professor Jason Donev. Right. Jason Donev, thank you for taking the time and speaking with me on Podcast for Inquiry.
And thank you for actually trying to do an in-person Podcast for Inquiry, which I understand you've never done before.
It's the first time for me. It's the first time for our audience. It's going to be fun. Let's jump in.
All right, sounds good.
All right, I want to talk to you about nuclear energy because
absolutely.
This is a topic that is interesting in many respects, but the left-right political divide, there are people on very much in favor, people that are very much against. You have environmentalists that are very much in favor, others that are very much against.
And always have.
And so I want to start with, tell us about nuclear energy, whether you think it's a good idea, whether it's a bad idea, and why, and then we'll get into a lot more than that. But let's just start at the very basics. What is it, and is it a good technology that we have employed?
So, there's an awful lot to unpack with your first question.
Yes, it is.
So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to poke at some of those things, and we'll just chase down any rabbit holes you find interesting.
Okay.
So first of all, I always like starting by saying I have read a lot of research and done a bit of research myself, and there is a lot of evidence that there is a correlation and probably a causal relationship. I assume your listeners are good with correlation versus causation.
I think that's a fair assessment, yes.
Yeah, given the nature of your podcast and what I understand of your podcast. So we got a strong correlation, and I think we can meaningfully say there's a causal relationship, but not an onto relationship between having access to energy and quality of life. So access to energy is necessary, but it's not the only thing that determines quality of life. If you don't have good policies, for example, rule of law is fairness, equity, like all these things factor into it.
Necessary but not sufficient.
Necessary but not sufficient
is the terminology that I would use. For that.
So we need to have access to energy in order to live the life we want to live, in order to be able to travel the way we want to do, in order to be able to live in the kind of houses we want to live in order to be able to listen to podcasts or even make podcasts, in order to be able to have the food we want to eat. All these things, energy is a necessary piece. And 5/6, so, roughly we'll say 85 to 88% of the energy that we get from burning stuff that died a long time ago.
Right. So that's primarily coal, oil, natural gas.
Yeah, and we can fudge the edges of peat or liquid natural gas products or recent natural gas deposits. Like we can go down that road. I don't think that's why you want to talk to me.
No, I mean that basically we create a huge amount of our energy by burning things to boil water, to turn water into steam, turns a turbine. That turbine becomes electricity that goes through wires that powers our computers and everything else.
Yes, but that's actually only a small fraction of the energy we use.
Right.
Because most people are used to thinking in terms of energy being electricity. And an awful lot of the people who talk about energy strictly from the standpoint of energy being electricity. And electricity is a form of energy. But when you actually do the math, depending on whether we're talking about Alberta or Canada or North America or OECD countries, which are basically the wealthy countries, or the world, the percent varies, but somewhere between 10 and 25% of the energy that we use is electricity.
And other things are like transportation.
Transportation is comparable.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, in your home, as I understand it, you're based in the GTA.
Correct.
So, in your home, you're going to wind up using a certain amount of electricity, and you're going to wind up using a certain amount of heat. So, in the GTA, generally speaking, the amount of energy, the amount of electricity that you're using is actually less than half of the amount of energy you're putting into heating your home.
Okay.
But that's the piece that we're more cognizant of the electricity, because electricity is very flexible. We get more of our energy services from electricity than we do from, say, home heating.
Okay.
But it's an easy one to point at. And then transportation is another thing. So well over 90% in almost every country in the world, well over 90% of the transportation energy is coming from oil products. So not oil directly, but gasoline, kerosene, or diesel.
Right.
Exceptions are places like Brazil is quite aggressively going after ethanol,
which is based out of the cane sugar.
Yeah.
Okay. So with the understanding that electricity is non-trivial, but it's just a component of our overall energy use.
Yes.
Nuclear is used to create electricity.
And that's the one of the things that I always want to get very clear right from the get-go.
Right.
Is that I really like nuclear as part of our electricity portfolio.
But it's a partial solution in your view.
Yes.
Nuclear energy is a partial solution to our electricity needs, which is a small but non-trivial portion usage of our overall energy requirements.
And
okay.
And the percent, so energy use is growing faster than population and has been for a long time, at least 1970, and probably longer than that depending on how you bin your data, blah, blah, blah. But let's just go over the course of my lifetime.
Sure.
And presumably your lifetime. So over the course of, since the 1970s till today, in almost every country in the world, electricity use has been growing faster than energy use, and energy use has been growing faster than population. So while it is a sizable fraction, certainly non-trivial, but not the majority, it is a growing fraction.
Okay.
And most of the experts within the climate sphere who are talking about how we reduce our overall CO2 footprint agree. It's not the same sort of agreement that climate change is real, it's bad, it's us, it's time to do something about it. Like that's an overwhelming consensus.
That's pretty much everybody who knows anything about the subject. Okay.
But I would still say that the preponderance of the experts look at electrification as a significant fraction of how we're going to, should we actually successfully address climate change, which is a different question we can come back around to. But if we're going to successfully address climate change, we have to make the wedge that is electricity bigger. And we have to actually be growing electricity faster than we have been, even though it's been growing faster.
So we need to replace some of the transportation and other usage and heating and other uses of energy from their current sources, oil-based or coal-based or natural gas-based sources of heat and transportation,
exactly.
and make that electricity. And then with that, if this is going to make any sense at all, we need to reduce the amount of oil, coal, gas that we're using to produce electricity. We need to create more electricity, run more things on electricity, and create electricity in non-carbon emitting ways, or at least
Absolutely.
significantly less carbon emitting ways.
And to be clear,
Mhm.
I also believe that we need to aggressively try to figure out things like carbon capture and storage. We also have to work out some climate mitigation strategies. We have to work out some climate adaptation strategies. I teach entire courses on this. So what we can do in an hour here is like, you should take my course kind of thing, but that's not available for everybody. So anyway, read my website.
And what is it?
Energyeducation.ca.
Okay.
We're very pleased. We're very proud of energyeducation.ca. I've had.
I'll put energyeducation.ca in the show notes, and people can click on that and read all about it. Now, there's one strategy that you didn't mention, since we're talking high level stuff, that strikes me as a fairly glaring omission, and that is actually finding ways
Absolutely.
to reduce the amount of energy that we consume. So you were talking about the houses that we want to live in, the foods that we want to eat, the travel that we want to do. And I think that's an accurate description of our lifestyles. But do you think that from a normative sense, we should find ways to change our desires or reduce our ambitions as regards to energy use, so that we are happy and satisfied with a less energy intensive lifestyle? Because if we can reduce our energy demands, that could go a long way to solving all those other problems.
Yes, and let me quantify that for you.
Sure.
Because I understand your listeners would like me to throw around some numbers.
I like numbers.
I'm big on. I like phone numbers. I like I like lots of numbers. So if you take your hand and just sort of extend it out in a fist like this, and then you just go up and down. Yes. That's 1 watt of power.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
And to be clear, watt is a rate, so it's a joule per second. So 1 joule of energy per second is expended by just moving your fist up and down at the end of your wrist.
And so if I do it for 10 seconds, I've expended 10 joules of energy.
But you're doing that 10 joules per 10 seconds is 1 watt.
Yes.
You do that all day, that's 86,400 joules. That's 1 watt, because 86,400 joules divided by 86,400 seconds is still 1 watt.
That's right.
Okay. So if I stand up, and then I sit down.
Yes.
And I stand up again, and I just keep doing this. That's 100 watts. So when we're talking about a 100 watt light bulb, you are talking about one person standing up and sitting down continuously for as long as you're running that light bulb.
Right.
And the reason I like that particular amount of power of 100 watts is we like to call that a power servant. Now this idea was originally put forth by somebody I'm sure you've heard of, Buckminster Fuller.
Ah, yes.
So Buckminster Fuller called it an energy servant, and I actually prefer the term power servant because it is a rate. And 100 watts, if you do some math and round the numbers, if you take a 2,000 calorie a day diet, 1 food calorie is 4,180 something joules. So you multiply that by 2,000, and then you divide that by the number of seconds in a day, and it winds up being 96.7 watts.
So that's pretty close.
So if you just call it 100 watts, which I think any reasonable, okay, fine, maybe I had extra.
There are times when you need a high amount of precision in calculations, but I think in this conversation we can say 97 point something is reasonably close to 100. Every survey, that's with what we call within the margin of error.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm good with that.
So if we can imagine power servants, and we can imagine that our quality of life as a broad, and again, I'm leaning on the idea of Buckminster Fuller here. As a broad way of thinking about this idea of power servants can quantify in human terms how much power we're using. And if you look at the worldwide average power consumption, the worldwide average power consumption is roughly 20 power servants. So if you average everybody from Nepal to Sri Lanka to Guatemala to Canada to Iceland down to Chile, averaging all over the world, China, India, Bangladesh, all these different countries, you add it all up and you divide it all out, and on average, what humans have access to is roughly 20 power servants per day. If we then divide the countries into the haves, which I'll just take the OECD countries, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development countries, and the non-OECD countries, the haves, the have-nots. So if you divide this out, and you look at it, the average power usage among the non-OECD countries, the countries that are aspiring to have the level of wealth and access to opportunities, services that we have here in Canada. So the non-OECD countries wind up having roughly 14 power servants per day.
Okay. And then the OECD countries have
50.
50. So that is a big gap.
Canada is 120.
So we're over twice the average of the wealthy countries.
And higher than the US.
Is that because Canada is colder, so we use more heat?
No.
Okay.
Although that's what everybody assumes. The first one that everybody assumes is that it's colder. And the second one that everybody assumes is that we're far apart from each other.
That would be my second guess as well.
But
it seems a reasonable guess.
They are reasonable guesses.
But they're wrong. Okay, great. So correct me.
So
this is
they're not wholly wrong, but it's not the whole story.
Okay.
So if you divide the economy into primary, secondary, and tertiary sectors, I don't know if you've done a podcast where you...
We have not. So just very briefly.
Very briefly, primary is you're getting stuff from nature. That's your lumber. That's your fishing. That's your mining.
Right. Hewers of
wood, carriers of water, kind of thing. Farming, agriculture.
Yep. We're big on that. I mean, here,
so that's
recording here in Calgary.
yes.
Right? Oil and gas, fairly large industry here, to say nothing of wheat.
Yes, or canola.
Canola, yeah.
So that's primary. And then your secondary sector, that's your things like manufacturing and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And then your tertiary sector is things like banking, education, tourism.
Services.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
So what we see is that countries like Switzerland that are very tertiary based have a lower energy use per person, while countries that are like Canada, where we're hewing our lumber and hauling our water, when we're driven by the natural resources, the natural resource-based economy, we see a higher number of power servants per person. And this gets into this idea of energy intensity. How much economic good is coming from how much energy you're getting from nature. So while Canada is at 120, Alberta is at 260.
Right.
And that's the oil and gas sector.
Yeah.
Because it takes a lot of energy for us to run SAGD, for us to drill oil wells. There's a lot of intensity in that, both carbon intensity and energy intensity. Saskatchewan, with its potash mines and so forth, is even more energy use per person and more carbon per person as well, coincidentally. Not coincidentally, they're often linked. Where Ontario runs more in the 110 to 135 range. So it depends, but like if you think about it, the manufacturing industry, the automotive industry in Southern Ontario, for example, while very energy intensive and far more energy intensive than the banking industry in downtown Toronto, is going to be the automotive industry is still going to be less intensive than actually pulling bitumen out of the ground for use. So I've now gone down a rabbit hole. I hope that was fun. Getting back to your question. I don't think that every person in the world needs to be at the 100 power servants per person. But we're going to wind up with some economies that are going to need more, some economies that are going to need less.
Right.
And we have to look at this as a global average.
Right.
So in order to get people within, roughly Canadian levels of wealth, I would claim we're going to need something to the tune of 70 to 90 power servants. So we're talking about a 30% reduction in use, but also a significant uptick in the overall energy use.
Right.
That's tricky.
Yes, definitely.
So now let's get back to the original question, unless there's something you want to do about this before I backtrack to the nuclear stuff.
Yeah, let's get back to nuclear.
So when we're talking about the amount of coal we use,
yes,
we use more coal than you think. And I'm going to make a statement that always pains me to make. I am not a climate scientist, but I trust climate scientists about the climate. Let me just make that statement unequivocally. But I don't always trust climate scientists to understand all the nuances of energy, because energy is my expertise. And while I look at climate science, I go, yes, the details of feedback cycles and so forth, I trust that they know what they're doing. But as somebody who has actually reviewed the IPCC documents, like I'm a comma chaser, if you will, within the IPCC world. I'm a very, very small fish, and nobody really notices I'm there. But when I read that stuff, I'm like, okay, you're definitely getting the climate science right. But from the energy perspective, the problem is bigger than they think it is.
Okay.
So let's
So if we want people to have a decent quality of life for particularly in the non-OECD countries,
Yep.
we need to increase the amount of power, of energy available to them. We ideally could reduce some of the voracious appetite in the OECD countries, but our ability to do so is constrained somewhat because primary industries are incredibly energy intensive. Manufacturing or secondary industries are also energy intensive, and they're necessary because they feed the tertiary levels. They're the foundation on which the tertiary levels, like banking, finance, restaurants, arts, universities rely on. They're not as energy intensive, but they need the primary and secondary industries in order to function.
Yeah.
They need them as inputs. So we might be able to curtail our energy and power usage somewhat, but there are some pretty high. There's a pretty high level that we can't reasonably go below. Is that a fair summary?
Absolutely. I don't want a hospital that can't actually have electricity.
Right. It would be a far less effective hospital.
Far less effective. The doctors would be every bit as smart, but the tools that they use wouldn't be quite so facile.
Right. Okay. So
getting back to the idea of fossil fuels.
Yes.
Like I said, the problem...
We use a lot more coal, you said.
We use more coal than you think. So there's different ways of wrapping your mind around it, but the best way I've come across for wrapping people's mind around it is you're familiar with a train. Like a train that goes down the railroad tracks. Like you've seen many of them.
I grew up next to train tracks. I used to sit down and just watch them go by.
Okay, so you have some idea of how long what we call a unit train is. So a unit train is a train that goes from one place to one place, back and forth. Gravel is carried on a unit train.
Mm-hmm.
And each of those cars is able to, again, we're just going to round here, carry roughly 100 tons in one rail car.
Okay. And then there's multiple rail cars and
yeah. So then the individual train is kilometer and a half long. If you've watched train goes, you've seen that.
Yeah.
And if you've ever counted them, there's, again, we're going to round roughly 100 cars.
Okay. So that's 10,000 tons.
10,000 tons of coal. The province of Alberta did stop burning coal a few years ago and replaced it with natural gas, but the amount of CO2 that's emitted is it is a reduction, but not a sufficient reduction to make much of a difference.
Okay, I thought that it was actually far less carbon intensive. Gas was a far less carbon intensive way to create electricity than coal was. So that's an interesting fact.
It is definitely less carbon intensive, but you get into things like fugitive methane emissions. Like, are we talking just CO2? Or are we talking about CO2 plus the methane emissions that are coming out from now having this? It's a tricky thing.
Okay.
Which we can go into, but I'm trying to go in a different direction.
Okay, let's go a different direction.
But let's say it's not a factor of 2 down.
Okay.
Right? It's not a 50% reduction. It is vaguely equivalent to switching from smoking to smoking light cigarettes.
Cosmetic largely.
And certainly if you just look at numbers without the context of, yes, but we're still emitting more, it's an improvement, but...
Sure, it's not going to solve the problem.
Okay, so before the province of Alberta stopped burning coal like 3-4 years ago and replaced it with natural gas, for the most part, again, there's some wind that's gone online, blah, 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 but mostly what happened was we switched from coal to natural gas. The amount of coal that Alberta would use, so the amount of time it would take the province of Alberta,
Mm-hmm.
which was getting half of its electricity from coal, to go through one of those trains with 10,000 tons of coal on it, right? This is a train that you would watch that's more than 1 kilometer long,
Mm-hmm.
right? Is roughly 6 hours.
Wow. Okay.
So the amount of coal that Alberta was using in a year would stretch from where we're sitting right now to not quite your house back in the GTA. So we're sitting here in Calgary, and the annual coal use in Alberta, just Alberta, 1 year of coal use, if you have that on a coal train, would stretch from where we're sitting to almost to where you are.
Okay,
back
so
in time.
that's an enormous amount of material, enormous amount of coal.
And this is what I mean by we burn more coal than you think, even if you think we burn a lot of coal. So worldwide, so that's just Alberta.
Sure,
The global coal
a
consumption.
few million people as opposed to 8+ billion in the world.
Right. So the global coal consumption, if you put it on a coal train, and you have this idea of a coal train, would stretch all the way around the planet 40 times.
Wow, and that's presumably at the equator.
Yes.
Yeah, go around the world around the North Pole 40 times. I can do that in an afternoon. Okay, but around the equator. Okay, so that's a huge. That's really actually hard for me to picture something that long.
Right. So that's just coal, and that's 1 year.
Right.
And the mass, the volume of oil that we consume is almost the same. Natural gas is a gas, it's less dense, so I'm just going to compare mass to mass rather than volume to volume, because volume to volume just does not get meaningful. But if you're just talking about the total, like how much does it weigh, the natural gas is also comparable. It's less, but it's comparable.
Okay.
So when I say that the climate change problem is we have to get off of all of that, we have to stop burning that much coal, that much oil, that much natural gas. And we don't actually have to stop. We just have to bring it way down. And then we have to carbon sequester everything else. We are emitting 36-ish gigatons, billion tons of carbon dioxide every year from our coal, our oil, our natural gas, and also our concrete construction. That is very much an also-ran after these other three. But that's also something that needs to be addressed, and that's not something I have any expertise in.
Right.
So a gigaton, a billion tons, this is thrown around a lot in the climate change world. Best way I have of explaining a gigaton is you imagine an elephant that is 4 tons. So you know the elephant tricks of standing on top of each other. 1 gigaton is the elephants standing on top of each other from here up to the moon.
So it's not turtles all the way down, it's elephants all the way up.
It's elephants all the way up. Okay. It might also be turtles all the way down. And the turtle moves, to quote Pratchett. The turtle moves.
Yes.
The great twin is with us. But that's the amount of carbon dioxide that humanity is emitting every 2 weeks.
Hold on. The elephants from
the Earth to the moon is the amount of carbon dioxide.
Every 2 weeks, not on an annual basis.
That's every 2 weeks.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
And that's with all of the climate mitigation strategies and greening and everything that we've been doing.
Okay.
Okay. So the energy problem is bigger than we think.
All right.
So I teach at the university. You'll probably put some sort of bio in the comments notes, but we probably should have done this a little while ago. But I teach Introduction to Energy, which is like everything you ever wanted to know about energy. We talk about tidal forces and coal, and we talk about what do the oil sands actually do, and how does a car engine work. We spend 5 minutes on everything and spend an entire semester doing that. It's a lovely course. I really love teaching it. The energyeducation.ca is the textbook that we use for that class.
Okay.
So that's one course I teach. I also teach the nuclear power course.
All right. So let's talk. Let's get to
Just
nuclear.
real quick. I also teach the solar course and the hydro course.
And those are great conversations, and I'm not against them at all.
But we need all of them.
Okay.
So to replace coal, oil, and natural gas, we need to electrify, but we need to aggressively pursue as much solar, as much wind, and as much nuclear. And we are already aggressively pursuing solar. We are already aggressively pursuing wind, and should. We also need to aggressively pursue nuclear. And all of this context was for me to try and make that statement in a context that I'm comfortable with. When I say I'm in favor of nuclear, it is not I am opposed to solar, or I am opposed to wind, or opposed to hydro. Although hydro has a lot of problems we could talk about.
Yeah.
But when I say I'm in favor of nuclear power, it is very much an and, not an or.
Okay, so let me think. So that brings up one objection that
Sure.
that I can think of, and that is my understand. Let me make one statement to tell me if I'm more or less correct. The best way to have nuclear energy is on a constant basis, by which I mean you have a plant that's at a particular capacity, and unlike a gas plant, where you can shift how much gas you're burning on a minute by minute basis fairly easy. You can ramp up and down fairly quickly. It's very flexible that way. Nuclear is you've got like 1 gigawatt or 1,000 megawatts, and the way it should be run is like at 1,000 megawatts always.
Yeah.
All right. Wind, solar, these are intermittent technologies.
Correct.
Sorry, not technologies. They are intermittent power sources.
The technology provides intermittent power. Yeah.
That's right. So, and we have fluctuating needs. So,
Yes.
so if we go full bore on solar, on wind, and nuclear, we don't really have a way to meet when power demands spike or fall. So how do we meet surges that we didn't predict,
Or even the ones we do predict.
or even the ones that we do predict?
Yeah, it turns out that predicting electrical markets, my friends in the electrical market will wince a bit when I say this. It's a largely solved problem.
Okay,
Like
so
they know exactly how much the power is going to go up when people wake up in the morning and turn on their coffee makers.
right, and we have weather forecasts. We know on a particularly hot or particularly cold day that
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
After the big hockey game, water usage will spike. Yes.
yeah, the ocean level does not actually drop, though. That is a funny myth. But it is a myth, or it is a misconception, I suppose, because myths actually mean something else. Okay, so in terms of nuclear turning on, staying on,
Mhm.
traditional nuclear power plants are not good at load following, which is what you were talking about, the natural gas going up and down. The champion of load following is hydro. Hydropower is actually best at going up and going down because you're turning on and off a tap.
Right. More water that flows through the turbines, the more electricity is
Yeah.
generated. You close
Yeah,
close the dam a little bit, and the energy flow reduces.
and my hydro friends are going, Jason. I'm like, wait, there's a lot we're sweeping under the rug here, but like,
Okay.
generally speaking, hydro is the world champion at spinning up and spinning down. The next best is your natural gas power plants.
Okay.
Your simple cycle natural gas power plants are basically jet engines, the same thing that powers an airplane through the air. They're jet engines on a stick. Simple cycle natural gas plant is doing the same thing that your jet flying through the air is. It's just being held in place. So those are really good at spinning up and spinning down.
Okay.
Okay.
So just all of these need to be part of the mix, basically.
They do all need to be part of the mix. And that's one of the reasons why we're never going to get away from fossil fuels entirely, but we need to reduce it as much as we can. There's other reasons we're not going to get away from fossil fuels entirely.
Okay, but if we can get our world would look massively different if we could get to a 90% or even a 75% reduction in the amount of fossil fuels that we consume on an annual basis.
Yes, the world would be, I'd have a whole lot more hope for
Right.
the continuation of society. I'm fond of saying when it comes to climate change, it will not eradicate our species. Homo sapiens will continue to exist. Society, though, that's a different question.
Yeah, our current civilization is definitely at risk.
Yeah, so supply of food and so forth, very much things I'm concerned about as somebody who is not a climate scientist, but very, very concerned about them.
Yeah, we had an episode late last year with Catherine Richardson talking about planetary boundaries, and of which greenhouse gases are one, and we are massively in violation of the planetary boundaries of those. But there are others that I didn't even know about that we also have to seriously consider.
As it turns out, we've got other problems too. But
yeah, okay.
Focusing here. So in terms of nuclear,
yeah,
traditional nuclear reactors turn on, stay on, and you don't really want to run them up and down. You don't really want to do that with coal plants either, for various reasons.
Okay.
The more efficient natural gas plants, the combined cycle natural gas plants, where you're sticking the jet engine on a stick and then you're actually using the waste heat from that to run a steam cycle, those are a lot more efficient. And that's
great. Let's go with the better tech.
But the problem with those is those don't go up and down. So this is where the better
efficiency. There's a trade-off between efficiency and flexibility,
and economics, and dispatchability, and there's a lot of factors that the very smart people who do that stuff, I'm not one of those people who does that stuff, the very smart people who do that stuff are sitting down and saying, okay, we want this, we don't want this. So when you're talking traditional nuclear reactors turn on, stay on, and you don't want them to turn off.
Right.
So the 3 Mile Island accident back in 1979 happened specifically because they did what's called a rolling restart. Now, there's a number of things that factored into this.
Right.
But one of the things they did was they're like, all right, we're turning it off and we're going to just turn it right back on. And as a result of them turning it off and turning it right back on, they didn't realize that there were some problems that led to the 3 Mile Island meltdown.
Right.
So that's part of it.
So since I was going to bring this up later, but let's get into that. Another major issue or the concern that people have about nuclear energy is that of safety, not on a day-to-day basis necessarily,
Absolutely.
but when things go wrong,
They're very scary.
they go very, very wrong. And
They go very, very scary.
Okay, so the three incidents that
Yep.
everyone knows of. One is 3 Mile Island, and if you want to take a couple of minutes to talk about that in a moment, go ahead. But there's the 3 Mile Island, there's Chernobyl, and then there's Fukushima. I have my own thoughts on these three. I don't know if you want to hear them or not, or whether we should just go straight to
I
someone
want
who
to
knows
finish answering the dispatchability question first, though.
Yeah, okay.
And I'm not trying to avoid the
All right, we'll come back to it.
But-
I'm putting it out there, so now people know where we're going next.
Sure. So in terms of dispatchability, small modular nuclear reactors,
Mhm.
and one of the other things we need to talk about is one of the big problems with nuclear is that they take a long time to build.
That's on my list, but
Okay,
so
so-
we'll get to that.
So small modular reactors are attempting to do several things at once. They're trying to make them more affordable, and they are trying to make them more deployable so that you can get them out on the grid, making electricity faster. Small modular reactors are also trying to improve the load following techniques. So one of the things that if we're going to solve we're getting 5/6 of our energy from fossil fuels, if we're going to solve that, if we're going to even meaningfully address that, one of the things we have to do is start doing demand side management. And this is where there is a particular person that I find a loathsome human being, and I will not mention by name, but he's been a big advocate for electric vehicles. Is not wholly wrong in that we do need grid level storage, but grid level storage is a 100-year-old problem. You need to use electricity that fast from when it's created. So the electricity that's going onto the grid has to be used at the same rate as it's put onto the grid because it just disappears that fast. So there's this whole load matching thing. And trying to get grid level battery storage is hard. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it is difficult. Grid level, we don't store electricity terribly well. Batteries store chemicals. And this is one of the advantages of fossil fuels is that you don't lose them if you don't use them. They're just sitting there until you need them.
Right.
So we're looking at things like gravity, like you're actually picking up big concrete things and moving them up when you've got excess electricity and then bringing them back down again to make more electricity. We're looking at all this, but grid level storage is hard.
And it just are we any good at it right now or not really? I know you said we've been looking into it for 100 years.
We're not able to solve this problem in a meaningful way. But some of the technology that really is exciting me is hydrogen. So things like using nuclear to make electricity when you need the electricity and making hydrogen for fuel cell vehicles is one of the ways we can actually take. So if we say that 25% of our electricity in Canada, 25% of our energy is electricity, and 25% is transportation. If you're having hydrogen vehicles or you're having electric vehicles, that's another way to do it. And you're using nuclear to power the grid when you need it for the grid and power these electric vehicles or these fuel cell vehicles to make the hydrogen. If you're doing that, then you can turn on and keep on your nuclear. You can also take your wind and your solar and just say, okay, here's our entire portfolio of electricity. It's going into the grid. It's nighttime. Demand has just dropped. Great. Now we're going to be making hydrogen. Now we're going to be charging our electric vehicles. So that's demand side management. So yes, nuclear has not done a good job of load following. Nuclear is still, even with the small modular reactor improvements, and they are improving, it's still more economical and generally speaking better for your nuclear reactors if you turn them on and keep them on.
And could we switch between? So we can't change the overall level of output, but if we did have, like, we're creating hydrogen with power, could we switch between the power output of the reactors going towards electricity, and now we're going to create hydrogen? Is making that switch fairly straightforward?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, Fairly straightforward, yes. There's again a lot of engineering I've just swept under the rug there, but yes, for the purpose of this conversation, straightforward.
A lot of bright people have to dedicate their lives to creating this. I don't want to minimize.
Yeah.
I don't want to minimize the effort that goes into it, or the intellectual capacity devoted to addressing these problems.
Especially since I was going to send this podcast to one of them.
Yeah.
So, hi, Alistair. But yeah, it's very possible, and it's not only possible. That's part of the design of why people are working so hard on this.
Okay.
Because it's not just nuclear; it's that dispatchability problem that you're talking about with wind and solar as well.
Sure.
Also, geothermal, for what it's worth, is a turn on, keep on kind of thing.
Right.
For much the same reason than nuclear. So that's the dispatchability thing. Accidents.
Right.
Okay. So
there's the three, as I said, so there are three that everyone
knows about.
Right.
And there's a bunch that people don't know about, which I always find a little amusing. And I'm always a little like, do I talk about the one on my birthday? Like the SL-1 disaster of 1962 in Idaho killed 3 people, was far more deadly than 3 Mile Island, but it was handled differently emotionally than 3 Mile Island. So we had a nuclear accident here in Canada where one of the nuclear reactors at Chalk River, which is our national nuclear research facility. So back in the 1950s, we had the first nuclear accident. It was, go us, the first nuclear reactor accident. And the U.S. actually, back in those days when the U.S. would actually send us helpful things, that the U.S. nuclear Navy sent up people to help deal with the Chalk River accident back in the 1950s. As a matter of fact, there was a young ensign who later became quite famous, Jimmy Carter, that was it, actually helped clean up this nuclear accident. And clearly, given that he was the oldest living president when he died, former president, right? Like I think he hit centurion, right? Like he did actually hit 100 years. Clearly, cleaning up a nuclear accident in his youth was, gave him superpowers or something. That's how he was doing the Habitat for Humanity thing. So there have been a number of nuclear accidents, but how they are treated in different decades and by different media sources dramatically shifts how we talk about them. So coincidentally, Jimmy Carter is the president who was president during 3 Mile Island,
right?
And he actually had a nuclear background, which made the whole thing kind of eerie. It's also eerie that there is a wonderful movie called I just blanked on it. Had Jane Fonda.
The China Syndrome?
That's the one. Thank you. Yeah. So the China Syndrome was in movie theaters while the 3 Mile Island happened.
That was Kirk Douglas too, wasn't it?
Kirk Douglas, yeah.
And Jane Fonda in the China Syndrome, right?
Yeah. So the nuclear industry sees the China Syndrome and then issues a statement about how the nuclear industry is not like that, and that would never happen in the nuclear industry. And then 3 Mile Island happened.
And then a few decades later, we have The Simpsons.
We have The Simpsons and Matt Groening. Yeah, man, I've made my career off of Matt Groening's Simpsons. I have entire talks on how The Simpsons has influenced our views of nuclear technology. So what's happened with 3 Mile Island is fascinating from a human factor standpoint, from a how do you safely engineer things.
Right. So my understanding is that there was a problem and it led to some damage to the reactor.
Correct.
But nothing. There's these enormous concrete buildings. I think they're called containment buildings, and nothing escaped that. So, okay, there was a mistake made by the operators and things went wrong, but the safety systems that were part of the original design worked exactly as they were supposed to. Yeah. So, I read one statistic that if you were standing, like, if the wall was right, if I was standing with my hand touching the containment wall, I would essentially get 0 additional radiation over the course of the entire incident, or less than a dental X-ray. Sorry, it was less than a dental X-ray. The amount of additional radiation I would get if I was leaning against the containment outside of the containment wall during the entire 3 Mile Island incident. Yeah. I would get less than the additional radiation my body would absorb would be less than a dental X-ray. That is an accurate statement. So basically, as far as public safety is concerned,
it was a success.
Nothing happened. Nothing bad happened at 3 Mile Island. They operational errors, and expensive,
very expensive.
and lots of expensive equipment that can't be used anymore. But in terms of public safety, nothing happened at 3 Mile Island. Can't really say the same at Chernobyl.
You cannot make the same statement at Chernobyl. So let's talk about Fukushima next, and then talk about Chernobyl.
Okay. So okay, sure.
So with Fukushima, you absolutely had a radiation release. Okay, Fukushima was much worse than 3 Mile Island, and
Yes.
much worse than SL1.
Yes.
And that being said, no one has died or will die as a result of the radiation release from Fukushima, as opposed to the roughly 20,000 people who died as a result of the earthquake and the tsunami.
Right. Okay.
So one of the things that I find really, really upsetting in talking about Fukushima is that when they built that nuclear reactor, they didn't know that earthquakes got that big. They didn't know that tsunamis got that big. And
Was that is that a genuine they didn't know, or they just didn't take that into account?
no, they didn't know.
Okay.
No, we did not know that earthquakes got that big back when Fukushima was built.
Okay.
The Fukushima Daiichi reactor, we did not know. The Fukushima Dani reactor was hit by the same earthquake and the same tsunami, but was, I don't know, something like 9 years newer. And as a result, all the safety systems that we put into place worked perfectly. So we're talking about one of the reactors that got hit, and the other one, people aren't even aware, was hit by the same stuff and did not have the same problems.
Okay.
So, so it is a true travesty. It is a catastrophe that a tsunami can come in and kill that many people. It is, from the standpoint of TEPCO, the company that owned the reactors, it's certainly financially ruinous. And Fukushima at the moment, that area is not one of the most radioactive places on Earth. So the amount of radiation that's there over the course of a year will be, more than what it was beforehand, but it's not as high as other places just naturally have radioactivity. So,
But there's still an evacuation zone around Fukushima, right? Like have people returned to their homes?
many people have returned to their homes.
And they're living there today?
Many people have. So this is complicated because the evacuation zone was large. It's gotten smaller over time. And,
Okay.
I have not looked recently to figure out
right.
what exactly is happening with that. But the evacuation did actually kill people. And a number of people in the nuclear industry are like, that means we should never have evacuated. I'm like, no, we didn't actually know what was happening at the time. And I think an evacuation was warranted. I do think pulling those people out proved to be now that we have more information, okay, we wouldn't have made that decision if we knew then what we know now.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember back during that accident, and I was talking with TV and radio and newspapers, and they were like, well, what do you advise? I'm like, we don't actually have that much information about what's going on. So I actually do think that the Japanese authorities that said, go ahead and evacuate, probably made the right choice based on the circumstances. But that did end lives. So the actual release of radiation was not as deadly as we need to do something in case there's more.
Right. So,
Which I think was probably a good decision based on, because a lot of people throw them under the bus for that. And I'm like, no, I remember the situation.
So I've spoken with a few people about that, like people who are environmentalists, people who are scientifically literate, people who care about things but are not energy or nuclear experts, right? Good general knowledge. And Fukushima changed a lot for them. So like with 3 Mile Island, nothing really happened. We haven't really talked about Chernobyl yet, but they say it was a Soviet design. The design was fundamentally flawed. Those aren't being built anymore. I don't even know if there are any operating anymore. They're kind of willing to.
Not now, but they did for a long time after.
Okay, but like the Japanese, Fukushima changed things for them because the Japanese are as advanced as any country technologically.
Oh, yeah.
Their engineering skills are world class.
Yes, but
I'm getting. Let me make the case, right? Like I said, these are not experts, so they're like, feel free to correct me. But
there's technological advances in any country. Their engineering skills are world class, and
Yep.
and basically, if something like this could happen to a Japanese reactor built by Japanese companies in Japan, it could.
Or American companies working within Japan, which
Yeah,
Yeah.
but basically that means that it can happen. It can happen anywhere. Like this is, you can't say it was a Soviet design that was rushed with political considerations. The other excuse is like, there's always going to be something
yes,
that you didn't know at the time because we're always learning more.
Yes.
And like by definition, as you learn more, that was something you didn't know. So. The confidence in the safety of nuclear reactors was really shaken by a lot of people I know because of Fukushima in a way that it wasn't from previous meltdowns. Is that perspective flawed? And if so, how can it be corrected? Or if it's accurate, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that as well.
So first of all, yes, like I can get into like the Japanese regulator was not as strong of a regulator as the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, which is a statement I would stand by. Truthfully, I really like the CNSC. Canada's regulator is awesome, and they don't actually pay me to say that. The U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission is it's not bad, but we're better. The UK has their own, like every country does their own.
And France, something like 70% or 90% of France's electricity is nuclear. It's
more like 70%.
70%. Okay, yeah, it's
you get
huge
into things
proportion.
you get into things like what's delivered to the grid versus what the capacity is, and it can lead to different numbers.
Okay. So all right,
70% is a good number.
So the Japanese regulator was a little bit weaker than it would ideally would be.
Yeah, but that's not why Fukushima happened.
Yeah. Okay.
And there's certainly people in the nuclear industry who point out that the backup diesel generators were down at the bottom of the hill, and if they had just put them up at the top of the hill. So the Japanese had copied what had been done in the US, and they had copied, people want to say blindly, but it was the backup system, right? Like, I don't think it's fair to blame the regulator, and I don't think it's fair to blame where the diesel generators were. Yes, if they had been on the top of the hill, coincidentally, sure, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. But I don't like pointing at random coincidences and blaming everything on that.
Sure.
What I do think, though, is that you're right. Fukushima shook people's confidence in the technology to the core. It shook a lot of people's confidence in nuclear power in a way that hadn't been shaken in a long time. To be clear, 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl in their day shook up the world about nuclear power every bit as much, and possibly more, especially Chernobyl, than Fukushima did. A lot was learned from 3 Mile Island. So the mistake that was made at 3 Mile Island was a mistake that a different power plant had already made and knew about and knew how to fix. So one of the things that came from 3 Mile Island was all the US nuclear operators sat down and said, let's start exchanging information about safety. Chernobyl happened, and the people who had been exchanging information with what had happened with the 3 Mile Island accident, like those people actually knew that what was going on with Chernobyl was a bad idea. But there wasn't any conversation because of the Iron Curtain.
Right.
My last name is Donev, right? Like I've got some experience with family on the other side. My family was actually in Romania. But there wasn't a lot of conversation back and forth. So after Chernobyl, the World Association of Nuclear Operators, WANO, formed to actually say, all right, fine, we're not going to help you with nuclear weapons, but let's talk about how to safely operate your nuclear power plants. And the nuclear industry is not unique in this. There are other industries as well. I'm an Albertan, I live in Calgary, and while I'm very concerned about climate change, I will give credit to the oil and gas sector for actually coming up with similar statements where, all right, we compete in the market, we don't compete on safety. So the oil sector is actually sitting down and trying to actually exchange what are best practices for safety because they want to be safe.
Sure.
Unfortunately, they also want to emit CO2, which isn't safe. But that's
Yeah.
but they
But
do
an oil spill is bad for everybody.
for everybody, including
There's-
the oil companies.
that's
So
right.
They want to
So
work
there's
that
some
out.
self-interest involved, but we'll applaud that. In that narrow scope, we'll applaud their
We'll applaud that.
self-interest.
Yeah, we'll applaud that self-interest because the self-interest is not necessarily against the public interest.
Right.
I have been involved with, although only peripherally, with some of the safety analysis that has come from Fukushima, and it is astounding that a lot of what happened with Fukushima is the idea of stacked disasters. This happened and this happened. So there's been a shift in the nuclear safety conversations to talk about, okay, so what if aliens come down and the aliens are allergic to concrete? Like, I'm being deliberately silly. But the nuclear industry is taking Fukushima more seriously than the non-nuclear industry is.
Okay.
And so all of that is true and is reasonable. Like the Japanese, I think the regulator could have been stronger. And they made the one mistake. But it's sort of like, gee, if I hadn't have tripped, then I wouldn't have broken my arm and so forth. Well, deal with the tripping hazard. Don't complain about complain about the broken arm, but like look around for tripping hazards. There's a Turkish proverb that when you slip, don't look where you land, but look where you tripped.
I like that one. That's new to me, but
So the nuclear industry is trying to do that. Now, so all of that is fair and all of that is said. The place where I push back on that is everybody's fond of saying when nuclear goes bad, it goes bad in ways that nothing else does. And that's true from a public relations standpoint. But do you know what the single most deadly energy-related disaster was? And certainly, okay, climate change, but let's take climate change off the table entirely.
okay.
So what's the most deadly?
I'll take a guess. I don't know about single incident, but in terms of total mortality and injury to human health, I would say particulate matter from coal plants giving people asthma and dying from, not asphyxiation, but from breathing disorders from the particulate matter emitted from coal. That's my guess.
You're a hair off.
All right. Well,
If we're
I'll take it. I'll take it as a win.
Because it is actually particulate matter and other. If we're talking about overall destruction to human health, but it's actually from biofuels.
Really, I did not know that. I
Because if
was
you're
way
burning-
off on that.
But if you're burning animal dung, and if you're burning charcoal, and you're burning wood, you're breathing that stuff in.
And the particulate matter from that is worse than coal.
Yeah, because if you're in coal, depends on what you're doing with coal, right? If you're doing coal for home heating, it's just as bad as the biomass. But generally, when we're talking about coal, we're talking about a huge structure, right? When we were walking from where you parked to here, we walked by the tallest building on campus, which is the McKimmey Library. It's like, 15 stories or something. The fireball for a coal-fired power plant is 50% larger than that.
Wow.
So the fireball that's burning all the time with a coal-fired power plant is roughly the size of an office building that's 18 to 20 stories tall. Okay, that's how much fire you've got going. But you've got all this engineering going into containing that, and you've got smokestacks and scrubbers and all these things, which doesn't make coal good by a long shot, but it makes coal better than it had been. So it's still bad, but it's not nearly as bad as the people who don't have access to quality sources of energy. As much as it pains me to speak out in favor of natural gas dramatically reduced the nitrogen oxides, the sulfur oxides, the particulate matter, the mercury that coal was spewing out. But what really kills them, it's roughly 4 to 8 million people a year, that are dying as a result of not having access to high quality fuels. And getting back to the non-OECD countries, that's why places like India, China, Bangladesh, Brazil, Paraguay, these are countries that are trying to figure out how to get access to energy. Because, at the moment, in a lot of the developing countries, they use little kerosene lanterns. They take something the size of a baby food jar, and they put some kerosene in it and a wick. And they close it up, and the wick pulls it out, and they light it on fire. And that's how they see after dark.
Mm-hmm.
One of my colleagues from electrical engineers, David Halliday, created NGO, a non-government organization, like a not-for-profit called Light Up the World. And I'll just plug that. I don't get any kickbacks or anything. But he was out hiking in Tibet or Nepal, somewhere in that area of the world. And he was looking at these these little kerosene lanterns that like fall over and catch children on fire. Like,
Okay, that's bad.
it's bad, right? Like, it's bad. I'm an electrical engineer. I ought to be able to fix this. So he came up with this technology where he sticks solar panels on these huts and has them charge these little LED light bulbs. And as a result, you're seeing improvements to breathing. You're seeing increased literacy. There's gender parity that this affects because it's almost always the women. In cultures where people are using these kerosene lanterns, it is almost always the women who have to go and get the kerosene. Globally. I don't know why that is, but just observationally, that is the preponderance. So if you care about gender equity, man, get these solar panels on roofs. If you care about literacy, man, get these solar panels on roofs, right? Like, so all of these things are happening, and we focus on nuclear. But I actually asked something slightly different, which is the single disaster. When things go wrong,
Right.
what goes wrong more, what goes wrong worse than anything else is hydro. The single largest disaster.
Because when a dam bursts,
You kill a lot of people.
and you permanently submerge
So the
towns and villages.
The Bangshan Dam in China in the 1970s broke. And I'm willing to bet that not only have you not heard of the Bangshan Dam, that the vast majority of your listeners, while they have heard of Fukushima and Chernobyl and 3 Mile
Yeah,
Island.
there was a mining dam burst in Brazil like 5 or 10 years ago that killed 200 people. I heard about that, but the Bangshan? Bangshan, okay.
Banqiao.
Okay.
Don't
so
hold me to that.
Okay, so it's the first time I'm here. So tell me about this.
20,000 people died immediately.
My goodness. Okay.
And depending on whether you want to include the famine that came from people not having water for crops, another 100 to 150,000 on top of that. So when hydro goes wrong, it goes wrong in a way nothing else does. When nuclear goes wrong, it becomes something interesting to talk about for decades after. There was a natural gas accident that happened right at the same time as Chernobyl that killed the same number of people that Chernobyl did. And they were children coming back from a holiday on a train. There was a natural gas leak and it just lit up, and all these children just burned to death. But we don't talk about that. We didn't talk about that at the time. Because
where was this?
in the Soviet Union.
Oh, this was also in the Soviet Union.
It was also in the Soviet
Okay.
Union. It was, I don't remember, it was within a year-ish of when that happened. And it just doesn't capture our imagination. Nuclear is uncanny. So we hold nuclear to a safety standard that we don't hold. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to throw hydro under the bus. If you look at it on a per megawatt hour of electricity produced, hydropower does really well.
Okay.
And so does nuclear. But if you're talking about what's going to just creep people out, what really creeps people out is you've got this nuclear, like this is empty, just to be clear. So this is a nuclear fuel bundle. So
Yep.
we haven't talked about nuclear waste yet, and we always wind up talking about nuclear waste. This is what nuclear waste looks like. This is empty. It never had nuclear in it to begin with. But it's a solid. The Simpsons is wrong. It's not green goo. But if this had come out of a nuclear reactor, we'd be dead by now. Invisible death rays coming out of this. And that is the definition of uncanny. That's ghost story stuff. That's sit around
Right.
a campfire and tell story. And this is part of how the human mind works. The human mind shares stories. Like when you said you wanted to have a conversation, what we want to do is we want to sit down and talk with each other and share stories because that's how humanity works. That's society.
Yes.
So
We are social storytelling animals. Like
Yes.
I've been saying that for years. That's what humanity is.
Yeah. So part of what makes nuclear and the safety aspects of nuclear such a particularly tricky thing is the nature of the stories that come from nuclear are spooky. So this is, as I said, this is a nuclear fuel bundle. This is the type we would use here in Canada.
Mhm.
So it's for those listening as opposed to watching. This is roughly the size of a rolled up yoga mat or a fireplace log. Would you?
Yeah.
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 Okay. So this right here, this rolled up yoga mat worth of, this is zircaloy. It looks like steel, but it's actually a zirconium alloy. So, sort of like, the fake diamonds, cubic zirconium.
Mm-hmm.
Same material, but in a different chemical form. But same element. This here, hold it. if it were full, would weigh, like 20 some odd kilos. So you could still hold it, but you have to actually work at it. That would be enough electricity for a family of 4 in Ontario or in Alberta for 200 years.
Okay.
If all of their electricity came from this. And this is why you may have seen the nuclear industry saying, if all of your electricity came from nuclear, the waste from your entire lifetime of nuclear would fit inside of a soda can.
Right.
So that's creepy. That's cool, but also creepy.
So here's something I've never quite understood. I'm talking about public perception here, not strictly science. The waste from nuclear energy is there's the really, really dangerous stuff, like what you just said, right? Like if that comes out of the reactor, it would kill us within minutes. But because it's so busy emitting radioactive particles, it's decaying very rapidly.
Yes. The more radioactive it is,
the deadlier it is. That's right. So if we store
but for the short period of time.
That's right. If we store it for a while, it's not going to be as dangerous in a relatively short period of time.
Right.
There's other stuff that comes out of nuclear plants. That's called like low-level waste. It's a little bit radioactive. Still not great, but it's not going to kill you. It's not going to kill you immediately. That stuff is radioactive. Don't breathe it. Don't eat it. It would be radioactive for thousands or tens of thousands of years. But if you're exposed to it, it's kind of okay for brief periods. But the ash from coal plants, the toxins from burning particularly coal, but also oil, mercury from hydro, that stuff is
also coal.
Also cool. Yeah. Okay. But that stuff is toxic, not for years, not for decades, not for millennia, not even for millions of years, but forever. Or close to it?
Close to it. So mercury freed from the environment. So mercury is locked in place. So hydro will actually introduce mercury into the active water cycle. There are geologic processes that take mercury out of the water cycle.
Okay, but the mercury is always going to be hazardous to human health.
Yes, but when it's geologically locked, it just that takes millions of years.
Okay.
So it's not a forever. It's certainly hundreds of thousands to millions of years forever. And given that, civilization's only maybe 10, 20,000 years old, I'm perfectly willing to say that 1,000,000 years is forever. But yeah, okay. So when you take your nuclear fuel bundle out of the nuclear reactor,
right,
very, very deadly.
Yes.
Levels of
and
radiation.
how long would this bundle, fresh out of the reactor, remain at that level of almost instant death?
It's dropping exponentially.
So what's the half-life?
There's a bunch of things mixed together, so the half-life gets a little complicated.
Sure.
But let's just say that you pull it out, and after 7 years of being stored in an Olympic-sized swimming pool, so they've got spent fuel storage bays where these fuel bundles are actually kept for 7 to 10 years, and 3 meters of water is enough to block basically everything coming off of that. And when I say basically everything, you flew from Toronto here to Calgary, you got exposed to more radiation and at a higher rate than you would be exposed hanging out at the top of that spent nuclear fuel. So water is a very, very good block for all of that for a couple of reasons. One, because the harmful radiation gets stopped by the water, but the visible radiation, the stuff we actually see, right, just normal visible light, goes through the water just fine. So we can watch to make sure that nobody's stealing the fuel bundles, because there's plutonium in the fuel bundles. So one of the problems we haven't talked about is nuclear weapons proliferation.
Yeah. So I want to cover a couple more topics, and I'm looking at.
But I want to answer your question.
Yeah.
So after 7 to 10 years, we could sit here and hold it, and we wouldn't want to be spending too much time, but it wouldn't be that bad.
Okay. So if we store something for 20 years, say,
So what we do is we store it in wet storage for 7 to 10 years.
Yeah.
And then we store it in what's called dry storage, which is a huge warehouse where these things are stored in steel concrete containers. And that can last for 50 to 200 years. And then the long-term thing is we're going to bury every country, all the 30 some odd countries that have nuclear power are all at different levels of agreeing that digging a hole in the ground and engineering a carefully designed spent nuclear fuel storage area is the way to do it. And full disclosure, I have worked with the Nuclear Waste Management Organization on behalf of both the municipal and the indigenous communities that have just accepted 6 months ago in December of 2024. So they actually voted in favor of having their land be used as a permanent storage for Canadian high-level spent nuclear fuel. So that's Ignace, Ontario, and Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation. And they took a vote, and the vote said, we believe we are informed, we believe we know what it is we are doing. We've been engaged in this process for like a decade. And after a decade of conversations, we believe that the information that we have is real, it's accurate, and we are sufficiently informed to make this decision with our eyes open. And Wabigoon Lake, the indigenous community's process is a little different, but there was a referendum that was held that was very, very open democracy, and 75% of the respondents said yes.
A super majority. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and like the whole report is available online. So Canada has a solution for spent nuclear fuel. And other countries, this is one of the places where Canada is actually on the edge leading the way. So Canada, Finland, Sweden, like there's other countries that are doing really good work as well. And I don't think people are doing bad work on this per se, but this is one of those places where we are so much better than the US. And I think Canada should be really, really proud of this, because we really are world class when it comes to safely handling our nuclear waste and how we engaged in the communities over a long period of time to make sure they felt comfortable and reasonable about nuclear waste.
Okay. Then let's bring up the topic that you just introduced. A lot of people do equate nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. Nuclear energy, we use uranium because it creates plutonium, which feeds nuclear proliferation. But proliferation, I'm talking about nuclear weapons, that our stores could be ransacked by terrorists to get the plutonium to create a dirty bomb, etc. But just the whole technology is so intertwined. The two technologies are so intertwined that it's actually a false distinction to talk about nuclear energy and saying that it has no relationship to nuclear weapons. So what are your thoughts on are nuclear weapons a good thing overall? And is there a connection between using nuclear energy, increasing our usage of nuclear energy, and the risk of nuclear weapon proliferation?
So we're
we're at time. Is there a brief answer to that?
In terms of are nuclear weapons a good thing or a bad thing, I will attempt to responsibly dodge the question by saying this. It is outside the scope of my expertise as somebody who studies energy to meaningfully talk about that kind of foreign policy.
All right. So,
but because I don't want to. But so I'm taking off my expert hat for a moment.
Sure. And now we're just hearing Jason's.
Jason as a person. I find nuclear weapons to be really, really bad. But I'm not an expert on that, and I shouldn't be viewed as an expert on that. But I really dislike nuclear weapons.
Okay. I'm not more technical, like the connection between
now the technical connection. I'll put my expert hat back on.
Right, between weapons and energy. Yep.
Yeah,
it's a fair distinction.
It's a fair distinction because.
But also, you're a human being. You're entitled to opinions.
Yeah.
I think everyone's entitled to. People's opinions should be informed. They needn't be experts in a subject area in order to have opinions.
And it's not that I'm uninformed about nuclear weapons. It's just that I don't want statements that I make confidently about climate change or confidently about nuclear power to be confused with personal statements that I make about.
That's a fair caveat.
Yeah,
Okay.
so that's my caveat. Now, in terms of the technical connections between the two, nuclear bombs can be made from plutonium. They can also be made from uranium. So uranium-235 is what makes the nuclear power go in a Canadian reactor or in an American reactor. Both power reactors and research reactors wind up producing plutonium kind of as a byproduct. And then depending on how you do things, the plutonium also gets burned up, but not entirely, inside of nuclear reactors. It is very, very difficult to take the technology of a nuclear power plant and turn that into nuclear bombs. So the connection there is not what most people think.
Okay. If I was a terrorist, or for just for personal research purposes, I wanted to create a nuclear bomb, I wanted to obtain one. There would be easier ways to do it than ransacking a nuclear energy facility.
Correct.
Okay.
If for no other reason than the security of nuclear energy facilities is extensive. Now, you mentioned dirty bombs, and a dirty bomb is different from a nuclear bomb. And dirty bombs are also bad.
Okay.
A dirty bomb is when you take something like radioactive material and you could pack that around a conventional explosive and then explode it somewhere.
Oh, so then it's not a nuclear explosion. That's just spread. You're using conventional explosives to spread radioactive materials over a wide area.
Well, not even that wide of an area. It'd be like, a few city blocks in a
Okay.
downtown area, and that's a weapon of terror.
Right.
The purpose of that and the damage that does is people go, oh my God, radioactivity, and then they're actually frequently killed because they're so terrified.
The panic and evacuation does extensive damage far in excess of the actual explosive device and the consequences, direct consequences.
Yeah, so that's what a dirty bomb is.
Okay.
It's a terrible thing. A nuclear weapon is using the incredible energy contained within nuclear material to level a city.
Right.
Which is a different thing than a dirty bomb.
Fair enough.
So when we're talking about building nuclear weapons, that is a remarkably difficult technical challenge to do, which is one of the reasons why so few countries have been able to make nuclear weapons.
All right.
We have mechanisms in place, and this is where I actually know a little more than I'm going to say, because I'm not a complete fool, and this is going out on the internet and so forth. But there are experts, and I'm not one of them, but I'm not ignorant of this. There are mechanisms in place to check and make sure that bombs are not getting into people's hands. And in addition to being a very big technical challenge, we, the nuclear industry, are aware of where a lot of those choke points are. And we wind up watching for those choke points in order and watching people doing the things that you need to do in order to make a bomb. So it's not the power plant itself, but Canada has come up with a way of using heavy water to make nuclear reactors that don't involve changing the isotopic composition of uranium. The US has a different design. So the US needs to enrich the amount of U-235. So the uranium-235, the bit that makes it go, is at the 4-ish%. So naturally it's at 0.7%.
Right.
And when you're talking about boiling water, pressurized water reactors like they use in the US or Japan, like Fukushima, you're talking about 4% U-235. To make a nuclear bomb, you need to get your uranium-235 from the 0.7 where it starts, not up to 4%, but up to at least 85 and preferably 90% uranium-235. Okay. That's the sort of thing you can see from space.
All right, I've got it. I want to ask, I've got like 3 or 4 questions I really want to get to. I'm going to hope that I can get some fairly brief answers so that we end this episode before 6 hours are over.
Or you can invite me back.
We could. I think we've definitely got enough for another episode. I've got a ton of questions, but you mentioned that we use natural uranium, the 0.7%.
Yep.
I remember reading about a dozen years ago that Canada sold or dismantled the Atomic Energy of Canada Limited. And my understanding was that our CANDU reactors, these are the reactors that use natural uranium, while they still exist in the world, that essentially R&D was done and that we weren't going to be building anymore. Is that, like, what's the current status of the Canadian reactors that just use natural uranium, is there still development going on? Are they being built anywhere in the world? Could they be built today?
They could be built, and we wouldn't build the reactors from 30 years ago any more than we would build the cars from 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So SNC-Lavalin, which is now Atkins-Realis, I haven't checked the news this morning, but
Okay.
is a Canadian company that now has the intellectual property rights to the CANDU reactor. They have announced a new version of the CANDU reactor called the Monarch reactor, which could absolutely use natural uranium. So that's absolutely a thing that could happen, and I can put you in touch with experts who can talk about what it is they want to do with that.
But they haven't.
They haven't built one in a while.
Right.
There are other possible reactors, like you could make an SMR, one of these small modular reactors, with a CANDU design. But people are also interested in things like molten salt reactors, which is something else.
We definitely need to have a second conversation to get into that.
But to go back to the nuclear bomb thing.
Yep.
As I said, as a person, I think nuclear bombs are terrible. What I can say as an expert, though, is that it's the enriching that makes it possible to take the U-235 and turn it into a bomb.
Okay.
And that is very, very hard to do, fortunately. The fortunately is me putting on my non-expert hat. But as an expert, I can say it is very, very difficult to do.
So it's very, very hard from a practical perspective. It's nearly impossible to enrich uranium to 80%, 85, 90% in a clandestine manner.
Correct. And there are certain countries, again, I don't want to speak too much on a podcast about this, but there are certain countries that attempted that, and the international regulations and the International Atomic Energy Agency, who is the international agency that watches for stuff like this, is like, yo, over there. So what happens is when you have nuclear power plants, you have people engaging in the nuclear industry in an upfront, transparent way, because that's how the nuclear industry insists on behaving. Okay. So I actually claim that having nuclear power decreases the risk of nuclear weapons proliferation, because you don't wind up having people, silently over in a corner, clandestinely putting together nuclear bombs. You have people who are fully engaged and at the table and trying to get electricity. The last thing I want to close with, and I think this will be a good place for us to close this first session, I'm happy to do a second session, is the megatons to megawatts project, where a treaty was reached between the U.S. and the former USSR, where they, from the standpoints of turning their swords back into plows, they actually took nuclear weapons and they took the fissile material, the plutonium and the uranium, from these nuclear warheads and powered U.S. nuclear reactors. This was part of the nuclear disarmament.
That's great.
So the megatons to megawatts project is an excellent example of how, if we are actually talking with each other and being skeptical in a scientific way, to really sit down and say, let's use our brains and have a conversation. And like your listeners like to do, open our ears to learn something new. We can actually unpack and discover that there's an awful lot of opportunities here that we just can't imagine without actually having these conversations.
I have so many more questions. I want to talk about SMRs. You mentioned molten salt. I want to talk about cost. I want to talk about the actual carbon footprints involved. That's at least another hour of conversation just on the things that we've already touched on in one way or another. But this has been great. Jason, I want to thank you for taking the time and speaking with me.
Leslie, thank you for
let's find another time. I haven't done a 2-part episode with the same guest before, but I think that certainly this is warranted. Sometime in the next few weeks or months, we'll find a time, and I want to have the opportunity to ask all of the questions that I haven't gotten to. And this is really hard for me because I want to ask you right now. But I was going to say, I was about to pat myself on the back and say I'm showing some restraint, but we're approaching 80 plus minutes. I haven't been all that restrained, but thank you, Jason. I always want to give my guests the last word. So do you have any thoughts that you want to impart upon our listeners and viewers before we say goodbye, at least on this part one conversation?
So one of the things that speaking as a university professor, I always love saying, because I really believe this, is that I have the privilege of working with the 18 to 25-ish set all the time. And I've got to say that kids today are awesome. If it's okay to call them kids. But
From my perspective,
kids. But
you're less than half my age. You're a kid. Your perspective may differ on what a 22-year-old is, but
sure. But
my kid is 20. My eldest kid is 20. So call them kids.
So I look at kids today and I think to myself, the future's in good hands. There's a lot of technology that's still possible. There's a lot of good that can happen. Climate change is going to be bad. It's real. It's bad. It's us. It's fossil fuels. We got to do something. We got to do something aggressive. And we shouldn't wait for these kids to grow up. But I am very, very excited when I look at the next generation coming. And I have a lot of hope and I have a lot of faith in the people who are coming up through the ranks doing great things, because there's a lot of good left to do.
All right. Well, I thank you for ending on a high note. This has been great. Jason Donev, thanks for being my guest today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed today's podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star review and showing your support at patreon.com/podcastforinquiry. Email us podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We are a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. Help us support rational discourse and evidence-based decision-making by becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. CFIC is on the web, on Facebook, and you can follow us on Blue Sky at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Zach Dumont and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblatt. See you next time.